Today we have Chair Professor in Economics, Professor Dileni Gunewardena, to talk about gender economics through her presentation titled Using a Gender Lens in Economic Analysis. So welcome, Professor, and thank you very much for taking up this guest lecture. Let me give a brief introduction to Professor Gunewardena. Although Professor is no newcomer at CEPA, she has been a CEPA member since 2008. So Professor Gunewardena's interest varies, and her publications are around gender, ethnic wage gaps, human capital, child nutrition and growth, consumption, and multidimensional poverty. She has contributed to several World Bank poverty profiles on Sri Lanka, as well as to national human development reports on Sri Lanka and reports on progress towards the Millennium Development Goals in Sri Lanka. Looking at her publications, she has a lot of peer-reviewed articles, books to her credit. Human capital and gender inequality in middle-income countries, schooling, learning, and socio-emotional skills in the labor market is the most recent one. It was just launched in November 2022, a Routledge publication. So we are eagerly waiting to see this publication. And also our very own landmark publication, Poverty Measurements, published in 2004. So she, as I said before, she has many peer-reviewed papers in a global scale. And one interesting paper I thought when I did my research was that this article, this publication, it's a World Bank policy research paper, More Than Schooling, Understanding Gender Differences in the Labor Market When Measures of Skills Are Available. I thought of citing this because of today's presentation, which is looking at gender economics. So Professor Gunewardena, looking at her academic profile, Professor Gunewardena has a PhD in economics from the American University in Washington, DC, and a Bachelor of Economics from the University of Peradeniya. She has been Fulbright Scholar twice at the Brookings Institute in Washington, D.C., and a Echidna Global Scholar. She won twice the Global Development Network Award. She is a member of a scientific support team of the Partnership for Economic Policy Research Network and leads an initiative to develop an online course in gender economics for PEP. So, coming back to home ground, Professor Gunewardena has pioneered gender economics at the University of Peradeniya. She was the founder coordinator of the Masters of Development Practice program at the University of Peradeniya, having successfully led a team from the University of Peradeniya to obtain a MacArthur Foundation grant to develop and launch this program. She currently leads the initiative to promote postgraduate teaching and research in gender economics at the University of Peradeniya, supported by the American University. So, Professor Gunewardena, welcome once again. And I'd like to invite you to make your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Indika. That was a very kind and detailed introduction. And I promise I won't leave without doing a little bit more self-advertising. Hopefully not myself, but things I do. But let me go straight to what we're going to talk about today. Okay, so as we said, using a gender lens in economic analysis was the topic that I chose to speak on. And I have actually used this photograph. I sort of try to use this photograph to brand the program that we have at Peradeniya in graduate economics. So I'll talk a little bit about that at the end of the presentation or during question time. But let me talk about let me go on to what I want to do today. So I'll talk a little bit about the dimensions and costs of gender inequality. And then I'll focus on the core principles and concepts, and then discuss some contributions that feminist economics, which uses a gender lens, has contributed to economics. Now I realize that not everybody who's participating may be an economist. So I've tried to keep that in mind when I prepared, which slides to use. And as I talk, I will also do that. So feel free if you have any questions, either during question time or if you want to write it in the chat. I think some of you know, but maybe all of you don't know that I have a hearing disability. So I'd prefer if you wrote your questions in the chat, but we also have closed captions, so I can follow on the screen as well if you really want to ask it rather than write it. So let me move on to the dimensions and costs of gender inequality. And I will go through this section fairly fast because, there's nothing new or unique in what this section projects. And I'm sort of preaching to the choir here when I talk about it. So women are less likely to be in the labor force than men. And you can see that in many countries and regions over the world, there is a gap. In some areas like Latin America and the Caribbean, and in the developed world, this wage gap it's not the wage gap, it's the gap in labor force participation, the gender gap in labor force participation. It has been decreasing over time. In other areas, it has been increasing or decreasing very marginally. There are earnings gaps between men and women. And these vary depending on whether we are talking about salaried workers, whether we are talking about farmers, or whether we are talking about entrepreneurs. And this is actually from the World Bank, the World Development Report 2012, which is the last one that focused on gender. And we see that, women can get paid. We have Sri Lanka and entrepreneurs, and they get paid 50 cents for every dollar that a man earns. And in Bangladesh, it's 12 cents. And then we see, for example, among farmers, let me take farmers in Benin get 80 cents for every dollar that a male farmer earns, which is not bad. And in Malawi, it's 90 cents. So farmers are actually not doing too bad comparatively. And then salaried workers, we see also 80, in Iceland, 69%, and so on. Now, women are also less likely to start an enterprise than men. So this is an enterprise, sorry. So this is total early stage entrepreneurial activity, which is people who started or have an enterprise that is less than 42 months old. And this basically, we see that women, which is the blue line, are much less likely to start an enterprise than men. Women are also more likely to be low-paid workers. And we see here, so this is the incidence of low-paid workers. Again, blue is women, yellow is men. And we see that, with some exceptions, that maybe just one exception here in Spain, women are more likely to be low-paid workers than men. So there's a greater percentage of women who are low-paid workers than there are men. And then we have the gender gap in the share of informal employment in total employment, including agriculture. And this is from ILO 2019. And again, we see that in many countries, this share is quite large. For Sri Lanka, I'm not sure whether the color is visible, But for Sri Lanka, actually, men have a greater proportion. So I think this must be a dark blue here. Dark blue or this second color. I think it's something like 40-something% women and 50-something% men, which is the share of informal employment in total employment. Then women are more likely to be in precarious jobs. So 81% of domestic workers are women, and 1 in every 25 female wage earners are employed in domestic work globally. And 74.3% of migrant workers were women. So we see that, and almost every 6th domestic worker in the world is an international migrant. So we see some level of precarity there as well. Women are less likely to own land. So this is the percentage of men who own land alone. And over here is the percentage of women who own land alone. And this is the 45-degree line. And we see that in most countries are situated on this side, where men own more relative to women. Young girls and women in reproductive ages are poorer than men. So we see that here. So young girls and women in reproductive ages. So this was from a sample of 89 countries done by a study joint with the World Bank and UN Women. And this was when they used the data to actually, rather than just looking at female-headed households, which is what we used to do, which was not a very good practice, they looked at the actual ages and gender of people in these households. So again, this is not necessarily calculating their actual intra-household status, but it's capturing, the gender and age composition of households by their poverty status. Women also have more time poverty than men. So if we look at, so over here we have the yellow line is unpaid work and the blue line is paid work. So the height of each line is the total amount of work. And for each group here, the first column is women. And we can see that in every group practically, except for the Americas, where there's a slight difference in favor of where men have more. But everywhere else, we see that women spend more time in work, both paid and unpaid, than men. And then finally, thanks to Amartya Sen, we focus on missing women now, women who should be there in the population, but who are not there. And we look at it by age categories, and we find that there is a large proportion of women, girls and women who are not, who do not exist, who are to exist under normal circumstances. So why do these inequalities matter? There's both intrinsic reasons and instrumental reasons. And the intrinsic reasons are bargaining power and, the intrinsic reasons are that, obviously women are also part of the human race. And so if we care about human rights, women's rights are human rights, right? It also gives them more bargaining power and greater agency if inequalities are addressed. The instrumental reasons, which have become more visible in the last few years or decades, I would say maybe in the last decade, is that they have an economic cost. And removing these is the smart thing to do. So there's labor market productivity and potential increase in output from women's greater and better participation in the labor market. Things like access to resources like land increases agricultural productivity and total output. And then the intergenerational effects, which we've known for quite a while, that money in the hands of women is more likely to be spent on food and their children's education than money in the hands of their spouses. So the costs of gender inequality, and this is the September 2015 report by the McKinsey Institute, but there have been studies since that as well. So this report basically showed that you could add 28 trillion of additional annual GDP in 2025 in the full potential scenario of bridging the gender gap, which is equivalent to the combined US and China economies today. So today was 2015. And so that's if, you know, all countries matched the best country. But if all countries matched their best in region country, so that's a lower goal, you could still add 12 trillion to GDP. And that's equal to twice the likely contribution of women to GDP, global GDP growth in the business as usual scenario. So basically, inequality hurts the economy as well. Now, it's important to highlight that the intrinsic reason is sufficient. And it's also important to keep in mind that, you know, smart economics does not always work. There are countries that have grown by treating women unequally, right? But the smart economics argument seems to have made headway. And I'm quoting Naila Kabir, who's a well-known feminist economist, who says that advocacy on behalf of women, which builds on claimed synergies between feminist goals and official development priorities, had made greater inroads into the mainstream development agenda than advocacy which argues for these goals on intrinsic grounds. So I take the view that, you know, if it works, if we are able to bring about change by putting forward the smart economics argument, go for it. That's my viewpoint. So core principles and concepts and some contributors to the field. So I think the basic difference, and probably people at CEPA, you know this and don't need to be told it, but let me do it anyway. The basic difference between gender and sex is that with sex, we are referring to the biological attributes that define being male or female. Whereas with gender, we are referring to the socially given roles, activities, needs, responsibilities, and characteristics connected to being male or masculine or female or feminine in a society at a given time. So essentially the idea, and I've tried to show that by using pink and blue there, is that gender is something that society brings about. So whether you are a man or a woman is something that is determined biologically, right? But whether you fulfill your role as what being a man or a woman means in a given society at a given time is different and is essentially a product of society, right? And so when we talk about gender economics, we're really talking about that social idea. And something that's very common among people who don't talk about gender is that they don't have a clear view between these differences. So I think if you engage with other people, you want to sort of understand what they mean by gender and sex, and clarify that. There is actually a exercise that I do with my students where I give them several statements and I say, this is, women are more likely to do this than men. Is this a gender issue or is this a sex issue? And I find that this is actually a very useful exercise to do. Here are some of the things that I use when I do that exercise. So women can get pregnant, men cannot. That's a gender thing. That's a sex thing, I'm sorry, right? Women lactate, men cannot. That's again a sex thing, right? Men, or at least most men, can grow beards, women cannot. That's a sex thing as well, right? But women usually do more of the unpaid work in a household. That's not a sex thing. That is a gender thing. Women are less assertive than men in bargaining. That's not biologically determined. That's a gender thing. In general, women earn less than men. That is a gender thing as well. So there are many stereotypes that abound, that assume that something arises out of biology, but it's really a social stereotype. Okay, so gender is a social construct, and biological differences between females and males are interpreted by society to create a set of social expectations that define appropriate behaviors and determine access to rights, resources, and power in society. So that's what we mean by saying gender is a social construct. And that leads to unequal outcomes. So gender inequality is unequal treatment or perception of individuals based on their gender, and it arises from differences in socially constructed gender roles. So I've used this, the pink and the blue, but now the blue is larger than the pink, to convey that idea that this inequality is arising from the social aspect, right? That it's the fact that gender is a social construct that leads to unequal outcomes. And I think maybe that is the sort of core or crux of the gender lens, right? There's more, which I will cover in this section, but that would be, I think, the first point. Now let me talk a little bit about the sort of heterogeneity of people who talk about gender and economics. So on the left side, we have here, these are, sort of maybe people who started looking at gender 25, 30 years ago, or maybe even more actually than that. Yeah, probably people who started at least in the 70s, right? So we have Nancy Folbre, who's maybe the grandmother of feminist economics. And this is the logo of the International Association for Feminist Economics. And then here we have Diane Elson. And this is a magazine that was there in the 1970s. And if you look closely at that picture, you'll see that it's showing the many things women are expected to do in relation to actually their unpaid role, but also paid roles sometimes. And on this side, you have sort of development economists who have made a contribution or who, talk about gender. And here's Esther Duflo, Amartya Sen. So Amartya Sen, popularized many useful concepts, but I think the missing women, entire focus on missing women started with an interview he gave to the New Yorker, actually, where they used that title, missing women, which, was very catchy and captured that idea. This is Seema Jayachandran, and she is, I believe, the person who heads the gender section at the JPAL lab at MIT. So this is, doing experimental economics, the Poverty Action Lab, JPAL, the PAL part stands for that. And then this is the 2012 World Development Report. There's the World Development Report represents some of these ideas, but it does have some of these ideas as well. And if you look at, say the 1995 Human Development Report, which was the first report on gender, that had a lot of contributions from Nancy Folbray, and I think Sen as well. And then over here in the middle, I put her name escapes me for a moment, but Esther Boserup. So Esther Boserup was associated with, and I'll go, I'll talk about that in a little bit, but her whole point was that women were being left out of the development process, and I'll talk a little bit more about that now. And she talked also about, I guess she was the first person that we refer to when we talk about sort of the origins of, she talked about women in agriculture, but also agriculture and culture, and the different types of agriculture and the cultural differences and what they led to. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. So coming back to the core principles of a gender lens, human well-being is the defining metric. So this is as opposed to GDP, right? And we'll see why in a second. Concern for inequality in the distribution of resources and power. So that's at the core of, I think, a gender lens, right? And then the role of unpaid or reproductive care work for both well-being and the functioning of the market economy. So that arises from, and that is why we would talk about human well-being rather than talking about GDP, because unpaid work does not get counted in GDP, right? And the idea that economies are constituted of both paid and unpaid spheres. The idea that economies are gendered, and that this gender division of labor between paid and unpaid work underlies gender equality. And I've actually taken this from Marzia Fontana's slide on PEP training, from the PEP training on gender in economic policy analysis. This was sort of the forerunner to the online course that Indika spoke about when she introduced me. I'm using this with Marzia's permission. So this is showing us how the economy is gendered. So if you're familiar with sort of first year economics, you're familiar with this circular flow of, income and factors, right? So we see here, you have the household sector, and traditionally we just think of the household sector as supplying labor to the business sector, and the business sector supplies goods and services to the household sector, right? And income is basically that you spend on the goods and services and you receive wages here, right? But this is a little more expressive, right? So when we look at the business sector, we have formal and informal, right? And informal is both paid and unpaid, because there is unpaid business work as well, where you are a volunteer or an intern, right? There's the household sector, which has paid work when you employ someone, unpaid work, a lot of unpaid work, subsistence work, like when you grow vegetables in your back garden and so on, and then care work, when you look after children and elders, right? So all of this household sector is there. Then we have volunteer work, we have formal paid work in non-profit institutions. And then there's also the public sector, which typically is formal paid work, right? So we see that, you know, if you think about it a little bit, and, you know, if somebody were to crunch the numbers, right, we would find that a lot of this is dominated by women, right? The business sector is more male. Within the sort of lower paid or informal, you would find more women most likely, right? And even with, you know, non-profit institutions, you might find more women, right? And government, again, this depends on the country and the time, but many government sector workers are also women, right? But the point of this is to you know, keep in mind that this is, the economy itself is gendered, and there's a lot of segregation, what we call occupational segregation, both in large sectors as well as within, you know, basically jobs within these sectors, right? So there's industrial segregation as well as occupational segregation. Now this is the cover of Who Pays for the Kids, Gender and the Structures of Constraint, which is a book by Nancy Folbray. And I really like it because it shows, you know, you have, so this is representing the world of work, the business world, right? And then you have, you know, people coming home in the you could think of it as in the evening or in the evening of their lives, right? And they're being looked after here. And this is also a conveyor belt, right? So there is work taking place here. So people looking after old people looking after children, you know, ironing shirts. And here she is sending off her man to work with his lunchbox and, you know, water and so on. And there they all stream into the factory, right? So this is, you know, pointing out to us that there's an entire amount of work here that does not get counted and that is typically invisible in economics, right? And so that is one of the main contributions of the gender lens to economics, right? Now, let me just talk a little bit about these two approaches. So I'm doing a lot here in terms of breadth, not so much in terms of depth. So, you know, feel free to reach out to me if you want to know more about a particular topic. And as I said, I will advertise at the end where you could, you know, find out more about this as well. So, so here's Esther Bostrup, and a lot of, you know, her approach and her view was the whole idea of women being kept out of the development process. And that sort of embodies the WID approach, the Women in Development approach, which is the approach that a lot of people have, especially, you know, policymakers, people in government. The whole idea of having a women's ministry, women's affairs ministry, is really, you know, has its origins in the Women in Development approach. So in that situation, you're doing something for women. You develop programs for women, right? So if you were to ask somebody, you know, what's your, you know, where is gender in your portfolio or whatever in your programs. They will tell you what are you doing about gender. They will tell you, අපිට මෙච්චර programs තියෙනවා. We have so many programs for women. The gender and development approach is different in the sense that so gender is treated as a social construct. So we are not, here when we're talking about women, we're talking about sex really, no? But here we're thinking about gender as a social construct. We're also thinking in terms of gender as a category of conflict. Just as you think about class conflict, you think of gender as a category of conflict. So you think about how will this intervention work? How will men react to this intervention if we bring it in? What are the gender structures that will need to be changed if we want to bring about this policy? So that you think about the whole context when you think about gender and development, right? So in that sense, gender and development, I think, is a superior approach to women and in development. Because, people have arguments against women in development for a variety of reasons. And perhaps that takes me to the next slide, which is to talk about feminisms, right? Because I think, and especially in Sri Lanka, I have found this, that people talk about feminism also, I think, as a category of exclusion. So if you don't hold to this, this, and this, you're really not a feminist, right? And so I just, I had a little confusion myself as to what was a radical feminist. So I Googled it and found this definition in the Wikipedia, that they look at the root cause of women's oppression in patriarchal gender relations, as opposed to legal systems, as in liberal feminism, or class conflict, as in Marxist feminism. So I think, of these three, then I would position myself as a radical feminist, which actually I was not aware of until this morning. Although, there will be many things that I will talk about and do, which liberal feminists tend to do. I don't see myself as a Marxist feminist because I feel that Marxism subsumes gender in its analysis. So I think sort of, conflicts that I tend to have in feminism tend to arise from the point of view of somebody who is a Marxist feminist, who feels that you have to sort of, they're not just against patriarchy, they're against capitalism as well, right? So I think, many CEPistas might come from this viewpoint. So, so we may disagree on that, not because I think capitalism is something brilliant, but because I think it's what's there. And I'd rather be interested in changing things in what's there than waiting for the revolution. But that's just a little aside. So in that sense, so from that viewpoint as well, I would go for gender and development. In both of these, there's an assumption that development is a good thing. That was really why I saw the connection to this slide. No, let me continue unless you think that you need a break or you have questions.
I think, Professor, you can continue and we can do the question and answer session after you.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, sure.
Right. So here's a bunch of things that. Okay, somebody has a question. Yes. Clarification. Go ahead, Nadia.
Would it be okay if I speak?
Yeah. Yeah,
Go
if
ahead.
the closed captions makes garbage of what you said, then you might have to write it.
All right. I just wanted to check, Dileni, about when you said the additional GDP that bridging this equality gap could help. Is the bridging the gap, is it only linked to increasing female participation in paid work, or is it about monetizing unpaid care or adding a value to it? I'd like to know what the
Good.
distinction
Okay, good question. That's a very good question. So the question is, how does GDP get increased? Is it by monetizing the value of unpaid labor, or is it by including, by increasing female labor force participation? It's actually by increasing. So the McKinsey report uses 4 dimensions of inequality. Female labor force participation is just one of them. So I think, wage gaps are part of it. So for example, assuming, say, women are discriminated against and women are paid lower wages than they should be, if they were actually paid higher wages, then GDP would increase, and so on. So yes, so this is definitely coming from the bringing women into the economy, so more of a bid approach in a way, right? Than monetizing unpaid work.
Thank you. The reason why I asked this question is also because there has been a recent push, even with the IMF bailout, which says increase female labor force participation. You also see it with ADB in their push for more women in STEM. Those pushes, it's also coming off, I believe it was Marga who came up with a report recently, which questioned whether it then leaves women the choice to enter the labor force or not. Like some women could choose not to and still continue to engage in unpaid care work. But I understand that what you're saying is about bridging the inequality. So about more equal wages rather than increased participation necessarily.
Right. No, but increased participation is part of it. So assuming that, so that women who don't work become part of the labor force and then contribute to GDP, that would also be part of the McKinsey measure.
Okay.
Yeah.
I guess that's where I guess the unpaid care work will also come in, because it's the cost of who then does the care work if women enter the labor force.
Exactly. So in a way, you can almost see, you can almost hear the wheels, creaking, the smart economics argument. Because if your goal is to increase GDP growth, then you want women to be working. And then, suddenly you're thinking about unpaid care work, which you didn't for centuries.
Yeah.
Right?
And
So,
then we have the issue of, if the women go into the labor force, who then does the care work and who do you pay?
Yeah.
Who looks after their care needs?
Good question. So let me get to that a little bit. Or maybe we can pick up on that question a little bit after I do the next few bits.